Who is the greatest quarterback of all time? Well, the obvious answer is Tom Brady, and it's hard to disagree with that. This is going to be part 1 of who is the greatest quarterback of all time. I'm not necessarily making these videos to give an answer. I'm more making these videos in an attempt to give a different perspective on this topic. I'll give full disclosure though. Tom Brady gets my personal vote, and I'll explain why more in part 2. In this part though, I want to talk about quarterbacks that played before 1980. I want to break this up into 2 parts because there are plenty of candidates to go over, and there are even more candidates that I'm not going to be going over in this video, like Norm Van Brocklin, Sid Luckman, Y.A. Tittle, and many others. In this 2-part series, I'm going to be talking about every quarterback that made it onto the all-time team, and I threw in a couple of quarterbacks that may or may not have been snubbed. In this video, I'm going to be giving a brief career overview of Sammy Baugh, Otto Graham, Johnny Unitas, Len Dawson, Fran Tarkenton, Joe Namath, Roger Staubach, and Terry Bradshaw. The reality is that I could write an essay or maybe even a book on every single one of these quarterbacks, talking about their greatness. For the sake of keeping this video to a reasonable length of time though, I am only going to be doing 2 slides max on each of these quarterbacks. Some of them I will only be doing 1 slide. Now it should be noted that every one of these guys that I will be talking about had their high moments and their low moments. Everybody has had their moments of being clutch and their moments of choking. They all had their moments of overachieving and they all had their moments of underachieving. It should also be noted that records are made to be broken, and that saying is especially true when it comes to football and passing. And you will see it many times in this video. Also, quarterbacks from the earlier days of football have very misleading stats if they are not put into full context. So if you're underwhelmed by the completion percentages or the passing yards or the high amounts of interceptions, I would highly recommend you watch my Why We Have to Be More Respectful of Older Quarterbacks video. And actually, you should probably watch that video before you watch this one. It'll be linked in the description. Also, I feel it should be noted, and it must be noted, that none of these quarterbacks were gods, and they should not be viewed as gods. They needed defenses and they needed run games in order to be successful. There were times where these quarterbacks succeeded without having those things, but it was not as consistent. All quarterbacks need help, and every one of these guys needed help. So with that being said, let's try to figure out who the greatest quarterback of all time is. Sammy Baugh is arguably the most complete football player in NFL history. He was a 2-time NFL champion. He was a prolific passer. When he retired, he was the NFL's leader in passing yards, passing touchdowns, and completion percentage, with the completion percentage being a minimum of 100 attempts. He led the NFL in completion percentage 8 times. He wasn't just good as a passer, he was a solid defensive player. He had 31 career interceptions, and he actually led the NFL in interceptions in 1943 with 11. And he wasn't just a solid defensive player, he was a great special teamer. He led the NFL in yards per punt in 1940 with a 51.4 average, and that is a current NFL record with a minimum of 10 punts. And he led the NFL in total punting yards in 1943. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, every quarterback has had their moments of being clutch and their moments of choking, along with their highs and their lows. Here's some examples of Sammy Baugh balling out and being clutch, and some moments of Sammy Baugh not balling out too much. Sammy Baugh absolutely balled out in the 1937 NFL championship game. He went 18 for 33 for 335 yards, 3 touchdowns, and only 1 pick, and at 10.2 yards per attempt. Phenomenal. But then in the 1940 championship game, Sammy Baugh took a bad L. Sammy Baugh was actually on the team that suffered the largest margin of defeat in NFL history when his team lost 73-0 to the Chicago Bears. The Redskins committed 9 total turnovers in that game, and Baugh committed plenty himself. Now, do not get me wrong at all. Football is the ultimate team sport, and Baugh does not deserve all the blame for why his team got blown out that bad. But when you do get blown out that bad, that is a complete team effort. No one is absolved from blame. So that was definitely a low moment for Baugh, but he had many great moments. In the 1942 championship game versus the Bears, he didn't really do that much in the passing game, even factoring in the time, but he did have 1 interception on defense, And he also had 6 punts for a 52.5 yards per punt average. So he's showing just how he's the jack of all trades right there again. And then in the 1943 divisional game versus the Giants, which was a win, he went 16 for 21 for 199 yards, a touchdown, 2 picks, and a 9.5 yards per attempt. And again, he had 2 defensive interceptions in that game, showing again why he's the jack of all trades. So even with the 73-0 loss, Baugh absolutely deserves consideration as the greatest quarterback of all time. Otto Graham is a quarterback that doesn't get the respect he always deserves because of the era he played in probably. He was a 3-time NFL champion and a 4-time AAFC champion. He retired as football's all-time leader in yards in less games than Luckman and Baugh. He led his respective league in passing yards 5 times. He led his respective league in passing touchdowns 3 times. He led his respective league in completion percentage 4 times. He led his respective league in completion percentage while having the highest yards per completion twice. So he was throwing way difficult passes while having a high completion percentage. He was also a pretty solid scrambler. He had 44 career rushing touchdowns. He led all quarterbacks when he retired in rushing touchdowns. And even if we just go by right now, he has the 3rd most rushing touchdowns all time for quarterbacks. Graham didn't just win championships, he contributed heavily to winning championships. In the 1949 AAFC divisional round, Graham went 22 for 43 for 326 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 picks. He carried his team to a championship in 1950 as he went 22 for 33 for 298 yards, 4 touchdowns, 1 pick. He also had 12 rushes for 99 yards. He accounted for 95.9% of the Browns' yards in the 1950 championship, and he accounted for every one of their touchdowns. So yeah, Graham was a great quarterback. In the 1954 NFL championship, his team won 56-10 over the Detroit Lions. In that game, he went 9 for 12 for 163 yards, 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He also had 9 rushes for 27 yards and 3 touchdowns. He scored 36 of the Browns' 56 points. He accounted for 62.7% of the Browns' total yards and 75% of the Browns' total touchdowns. He did get very good defensive support, but he played a huge role in the Browns' offense in that blowout victory. Of all of the older quarterbacks, Johnny Unitas probably is the most respected. He was a 3-time NFL MVP, a 3-time NFL champion, and a 1-time Super Bowl champion. His 34 fourth-quarter comebacks are 4th all-time. His 38 game-winning drives are top 9 all-time. His 8 20-plus passing touchdown seasons were the most all-time when he retired. His 10 seasons of 2,500 passing yards or greater were tied for the most all-time with Fran Tarkenton when he retired. And he retired as football's all-time leader in passing yards and passing touchdowns. I don't want to be too critical of Unitas because he was a great quarterback, but Earl Morrall was able to take Unitas' supporting cast and do pretty good with it. In fact, he was able to get the Colts to the Super Bowl. That is probably the only potential drawback, at least in my eyes, when it comes to ranking Unitas. It's not just that Morrall got the Colts to the Super Bowl, it's that the passing offense took a pretty minimal step backwards in the season that Unitas missed the majority of. With that said, though, Johnny Unitas is absolutely worthy of being a candidate for the greatest quarterback of all time and absolutely deserved to be on the NFL all-time team. Now, I probably would not consider Len Dawson the greatest of all time, pretty much no matter what, but he is worth discussing at the very least. Dawson didn't even get a chance to show what he could do until his 6th season of playing professional football, and by that time he was 27 years old. When he finally got his chance to shine, all he did was lead the AFL in completion percentage and passing touchdowns. He was a 3-time AFL champion and a 1-time Super Bowl champion. He was also a 1-time Super Bowl MVP with a very solid performance in the Super Bowl when you factor in the time, when he had 142 passing yards on 12 out of 17 with a touchdown and a pick. His 239 passing touchdowns were 5th all-time when he retired, and his 28,711 passing yards were 9th all-time when he retired. His 11 seasons with a completion percentage of 55% or greater were an NFL record when he retired. His 57.1 completion percentage was 3rd all-time when he retired with a minimum of 1,000 pass attempts. His 6 seasons with 20-plus touchdown passes was top 5 all-time when he retired. He led his respective league in completion percentage 8 times. He led his respective league in touchdown passes 4 times. Now, what's especially incredible about this production is that Dawson never played with another Hall of Famer on offense. He had a great defensive supporting cast. There's no question about that. And I would even go as far as to say that the Chiefs' defense is definitely the biggest reason he has a Super Bowl win. But on offense, he never played with another Hall of Famer. So if he played with another Hall of Famer on offense, could he have had more passing touchdowns or could he have had more passing yards? Well, we'll never know at this point, but it's certainly food for thought. I don't know if this will make sense, but from a winning perspective, Dawson didn't necessarily do more with less. But from a production perspective, he did more with less than just about anybody in NFL history. I mean, every quarterback I'm going over in this video had at least one Hall of Famer on offense or played with at least one Hall of Famer on offense for more than one season. But Dawson didn't. Fran Tarkenton, in my personal opinion, is probably one of the biggest snubs when it comes to making the NFL all-time team. He retired as the NFL's all-time leader in passing yards and passing touchdowns. He retired 6th all-time in completion percentage with a minimum of 150 passes. He retired 2nd all-time in rushing yards for a quarterback. He retired 6th all-time in rushing touchdowns for a quarterback with 32. He was a one-time NFL MVP, and he led his respective league in fourth quarter comebacks 3 times, and he led his respective league in game-winning drives 3 times. Tarkenton, even when we just go by all of NFL history, is top 10 all-time in fourth quarter comebacks, and he is top 15 all-time in game-winning drives. And Tarkenton didn't always have the best supporting cast around him. He didn't always have a defense, and he didn't always have a run game. I mean, of course, there's times he had it, but for the most part, his supporting cast throughout his career was very suspect. That's probably why he didn't end his career with the best winning percentage. And you can even see right here, Tarkenton carried his teams on multiple occasions. 2 notable times of him carrying his team was in 1970, when he took the Giants to 9-5 with a below-average defense. In 1978, Tarkenton carried the Vikings to a winning record. He got his team to 8-7-1, despite having the 20th ranked defense out of 28 teams and the 28th rushing attack out of 28 teams. So now I gotta be the bad guy for a second. Tarkenton did carry his teams to winning records on multiple occasions, but it was not consistent. Tarkenton is actually a pretty prime example of how you should not put the whole weight of a franchise on a quarterback, because there were plenty of seasons where he had losing records when he didn't have a run game or he didn't have a defense. I mean, quarterbacks need help to win. For some people, it's difficult to comprehend, but quarterbacks contribute to winning. They don't win games by themselves, and they don't lose games by themselves either. And Tarkenton was able to win some games by himself, and in some cases he was able to carry his team to a winning record all by himself. But it was not consistent. Tarkenton did absolutely have his fair share of shortcomings, and he did have his fair share of underachieving. But even with those moments, it should not take away from the greatness of Fran Tarkenton. His abilities when he played were absolutely worthy of being talked about as one of, if not the greatest quarterback of all time, with or without a championship. Joe Namath has pretty much become one of the most underrated quarterbacks in NFL history, at least in my opinion. People like to talk about his record, his low completion percentages. He threw more career interceptions than touchdowns. Well, the dude played on one leg for a huge part of his career. And I recall on A Football Life, Joe Namath was told he would only be able to play football for 4 years. And he lasted a lot longer than that. But let's seriously talk about Joe Namath, because Joe Namath is another player that, in my opinion, you can argue he was snubbed off of the all-time team. The dude was a very prolific passer when you factor in the era. He was a one-time Super Bowl champion. He was a one-time AFL Player of the Year. He was a one-time Super Bowl MVP. A one-time Comeback Player of the Year. He retired as the NFL's all-time leader in passing yards per game. He was the first ever 4,000-yard passer in 1967. In that season, he set a record for passing yards per game by almost 15 yards. And if we adjust that for a full 16-game schedule, the difference Namath set was the difference between a quarterback throwing for 4,579 yards and 4,282 yards. And Joe Namath was very underrated at carrying his teams. In 1967, he took the Jets to an 8-5-1 record with the 5 out of 9 ranked defense and the 7 out of 9 ranked rushing attack. And in 1968, the year that everyone discredits him, he took the Jets to an 11-3 record with a barely above average defense and a pretty rough rushing attack. Now, his supporting cast absolutely did step up in the playoffs and in the Super Bowl, but Namath carried his team in the regular season more than he gets credit for, probably. A lot of people use Namath's Super Bowl win against him, actually. So let's talk about his 1968 title run. In the 1968 AFL Championship game, Namath went 19 for 49 for 266 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 pick. He accounted for 67.5% of the Jets' total offensive yardage, and he accounted for all of their touchdowns. So it's not like he got carried to a Super Bowl win. Now, some people will discredit the completion percentage, and to an extent I understand, but he was throwing a lot more deep passes in that game when you look at the average yards per completion. In Super Bowl III, he shortened his passes up, and he got a better completion percentage, and he accounted for 57.9% of the Jets' total offensive yards in the Super Bowl. He didn't throw a touchdown, but if that's the case, well, Tom Brady only threw for 145 yards and just 1 touchdown in his Super Bowl win over the Rams. And Russell Wilson only threw for 206 yards in his Super Bowl win, and his team still managed to win by 5 possessions. In my opinion, Namath has become an extremely underrated quarterback, and he's become a forgotten great. Injuries caught up with him towards the end of his career, so his production did begin to fall. But in the earlier part of his career, man, he was a great quarterback, and he doesn't always get the respect he deserves. So, is Joe Namath the greatest quarterback of all time? Honestly, probably not. Does he deserve to at least get talked about as a candidate? In my opinion, yeah, he does. I mean, he probably would have been the all-time leading passer for a brief moment if he had stayed more healthy. Staubach was a 2-time Super Bowl champion and a 1-time Super Bowl MVP. His 22,279 passing yards were third most in the 70s. His 152 touchdown passes were second most during the 70s. His 2,773 playoff passing yards were second most in the 1970s. His 23 playoff touchdown passes were second most in the 70s. He retired 10th all-time in passing yards per game. He led the NFL in touchdown passes 1 time. His 2,264 rushing yards were 8th all-time for quarterbacks when he retired. And one other notable thing about Staubach is that he threw less than 1 interception per game, and that's unremarkable by today's standards. But during that time, interceptions per game were well above 1. So that is an absolutely notable thing from Staubach. Now, his production wasn't overly wowing, but he was definitely a pretty great quarterback. Now, I threw in 2 curveballs so far in this video, in particular with Namath and Dawson, but Terry Bradshaw is an interesting quarterback because people use his stats against him, along with the fact that he had a loaded roster. And I won't dispute that he had a loaded roster, but let's seriously talk about Bradshaw. He was a 4-time Super Bowl champion. He was a 1-time NFL MVP. And he was a 2-time Super Bowl MVP. He retired only 13th in passing yards, but he did retire 9th all-time in passing touchdowns. And he wasn't as reckless as you might think. He only retired 13th all-time in interceptions thrown. He did have some reckless seasons, but he also had some very careful seasons. Bradshaw did, in fact, have a loaded roster, but he was not getting carried by that loaded roster as much as you might think. Bradshaw is one of 5 quarterbacks to throw for 300-plus yards in a Super Bowl twice. The other 4 quarterbacks were Tom Brady, Kurt Warner, John Elway, and Joe Montana. Terry Bradshaw is one of 6 quarterbacks to throw 4 touchdown passes in a Super Bowl. The other 5 were Tom Brady, Joe Montana, Steve Young, Troy Aikman, and Doug Williams. Bradshaw is also one of just 4 quarterbacks to throw for 300-plus yards and 4-plus touchdowns in a Super Bowl. The other 3 were Tom Brady, Steve Young, and Doug Williams. So yeah, Bradshaw definitely had a loaded roster, but he definitely contributed his fair share for the most part. There were times where the loaded roster was carrying him, and there were times where he was carrying the loaded roster. There was a very solid balancing act during his time on the Steelers. Is Terry Bradshaw the GOAT? Probably not. Is he a top 10 quarterback of all time? There's certainly a case. Is he a top 15 quarterback of all time? In my personal opinion, yes. But that's just me. Hopefully, I was able to provide a brand new perspective on who the GOAT is, or specifically the greatest quarterback of all time is. There's a lot of great quarterbacks that don't always get the credit they deserve, and hopefully I was able to give some of these quarterbacks that credit. But yeah, that will be all for this video. Who do you guys think the best quarterback that I've gone over is? Who did I leave out? Who should I have maybe talked about a little more? There's a lot of candidates to go over, but I just wanted to go over these ones at the very least. But please keep in mind, this is only part 1. I will be doing a part 2, and I'll be talking about quarterbacks from 1980 onwards. So I'll talk a little more about Joe Montana and stuff like that. But thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoyed.